Okay, so thank you so much for everyone's time tonight. My name is Farah Hirani, and as Curtis mentioned, I'm a content strategist with Content Strategy Inc. And so today I'm going to be going over how to write for web accessibility. So really this talk is about how to create content that's easy for your users to understand, regardless of their ability or their context. And so I'm just going to start with a little bit of background and just go over some definitions so that everyone's on the same page when it comes to accessibility. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why it's worth making your content accessible. And I'll show you how the way that your content is written might actually be creating barriers for people with disabilities. And then I'll talk through two specific examples, and I'll show you how to transform your content so that it could be more easily understood by all of your users. And then finally, I'll leave you with some next steps and we'll wrap up. So I'll start with this a little bit of background and some definitions. So the World Wide Web Consortium, which is known as W3C, is the international community that develops open standards for the web. And so this includes the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which some of you may have heard of, and I'll be talking a little bit more about those later. But the World Wide Web Consortium says that web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. So more specifically, people can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, and they can contribute to the web. And so I really like this definition because it's really specific and it tells us exactly what's in scope when it comes to making content accessible. And I also really like Mozilla's definition here, and they say accessibility is the practice of making your websites usable by as many people as possible. You might also think of accessibility as treating everyone the same and giving them equal opportunities no matter what their ability or their circumstances. And I think this one is great because it really underscores what I think is one of the most important and compelling aspects of accessibility. So really at the core of it, it's about designing your content to be flexible, and that gives users options to access it however they prefer. So to truly give all people equal opportunities, which is really what we're trying to do when we design for accessibility, it's important to be aware of all of the different varied experiences that people with disabilities have when it comes to how they access the web. And so the W3C has this really great resource here about the diversity of abilities and barriers that people experience. So I'm not going to go too much into detail on this topic, but really the main thing to note is that when you're designing for accessibility, there are a wide range of abilities and barriers to consider, and a wide range of abilities and disabilities to consider. Everybody's unique and they're kind of doing things a little bit differently. And so this includes people who are using assistive technologies. An assistive technology is a software or hardware that people with disabilities use to improve interaction with the web. So why should you make your content accessible? So I'm going to talk here about some of the benefits. So first of all, there are probably more people who are living with disabilities than you think there are. So in Canada, this number is at about 22% of adults who are living with some kind of disability. In BC, it's a little bit closer to 25%. And it's about the same in the US, it's 26%. So we're looking at about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people who are living with some kind of disability. And you might find this surprising, but consider that people with disabilities may have invisible disabilities. So you might actually know some people who live with a disability that you don't even actually know about, and you wouldn't know it unless they actually told you about it. Also, disabilities can be permanent, they can be temporary, they can be episodic, and they can also exist on a spectrum, and they can change over time. And also, some people might not actually see themselves as having a disability, even if they do experience some of the functional limitations associated with a disability. So it really is a lot of people. And in addition to the fact that if you don't design for accessibility, you are missing out on this huge market. You're also excluding people who could be benefiting from your content. And also, you're actually missing out on an opportunity to improve the user experience for all of your users. Because the reality is that everyone will face ability barriers at some point. So what's an ability barrier? Ability barriers are barriers that come up because of our environment or our context. So for example, imagine that you're outside, it's sunny, and you have your phone and you're trying to look at the screen, but you have a glare from the sun. And so you can't see your screen as well as you normally would. So that's an example of an ability barrier. Another example is if you're on a really quiet bus and you want to watch a video, but you don't want to disrupt people by playing the sound. And so that's another example of an ability barrier. And what's really interesting when you start to look at these ability barriers, you find that the same solutions that help people with disabilities access your content are actually the same solutions that are going to help all of your users when they find themselves experiencing these types of ability barriers because of their environment. So for example, people who are hard of hearing or deaf, they might look at a written transcript if they want to consume a podcast or a video, or they might watch a video but use the captions while they're watching. And a person who's trying to watch a video on a quiet bus is also going to benefit from those same solutions, right? They might skim the transcript of your video or of a podcast. They might watch a video with the sound turned off and instead turn on the captions. And another example, imagine someone who has a cognitive or learning disability. They might have difficulty understanding written text, and they might need your content to be really clearly structured and organized. If it's not, they might actually have trouble understanding it or finding what they're looking for. But alongside that, consider something that's actually happening all over the world today. Imagine that you're a parent and you're at home and you're trying to get work done, and your kids are at home and they're running around and they're popping in and out and they're distracting you. Maybe you don't have to actually imagine, maybe that's been your life for the last year. But if that's you, then you're also going to benefit from really clearly structured and organized content in the same way that someone with a learning disability might, because you're trying to get information in these little snippets while your attention is split and you're distracted. So the point is that if you're designing for accessibility, you really are offering flexibility in how people consume your content. And so everyone gets equal access, and what it really does improve that user experience across the board. But there are a lot of other benefits, so I'm not going to get into all of them. We don't have time, but this is another really good resource from the W3C. They actually do a really good job of helping you build a business case for accessibility in your organization. So if you want more information, definitely check it out. And I do just want to say one quick thing about legal compliance. So it's really important to check what the requirements are of an organization like yours, wherever you're located. There have been an increasing number of lawsuits in the US about this issue. And also Canada, as well as currently 4 provinces, do have web accessibility requirements in place. So it's really worth looking into what those are. BC is currently in the process of developing requirements. So it's better to be ready than having to scramble at the last minute to fix your website. So a big part of creating accessible content involves these more technical aspects. So for example, coding your pages for accessibility, having effective visual design. These are really critical pieces because they are going to reduce barriers for people with disabilities who are trying to perceive and interact with your content. But imagine that you do all of that, right? You've done your coding for accessibility, you've created good visual design, but at the end of the day, your users can't actually understand your content. Maybe your content is poorly organized, or it's too complex, the language is too complex. And so all of this work that you've done will end up going to waste. And so you really want to make sure that you're paying attention to how easily understandable your content actually is. So how do we address that? And that's really what I'm going to be focusing on for the rest of this talk. So I'll be talking about these 3 content writing practices that might be causing accessibility barriers for your users. And so the first one here is poor content organization on the page. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. If we look at this page here on the left just a little bit more closely, we can see that first we have this title, and it's not very descriptive, right? It doesn't tell us what is going to be on this page. And if you were to look at this page in the context of the actual website, you'd see that it doesn't really help. It's not much better. There's no section headings here. There's no sections. It's all just one big block of text. And so this is an example of a problematic page, and it has poor on-page content organization. And here's another example. With this one, the title is a little bit better, but it's still not great because it doesn't actually tell us what about English language proficiency that this page is actually about, right? So I don't know if there's going to be information on this page on different tests that I can take to assess my proficiency. Maybe it's about courses I can take to improve my proficiency. I don't really know from the heading, from the title. The section headings are also pretty confusing. They both start with the same 3 words here, proof of proficiency. And if you continue to read, you'll see that they actually contradict each other. And so it's issues like that. It's issues like this that I'm going to be showing you how to work through in the next section. But first, I want to talk about why poorly organized content is problematic for people with disabilities. So the main thing is that it creates barriers and it makes it harder for some people to actually understand your content. So for example, some of your users might be using a screen reader. And this is a piece of software that reads the content aloud for people who can't actually read the text, or maybe they find reading the text difficult. And so they tend to scan through the headings on the page. And so they'll often jump from one heading to another in order to get a bit of an outline of what's on the page. And so if you don't have headings, or if your headings aren't very good, then essentially you're forcing these users to read all of the text on the page just to figure out, if there's something there that they are looking for. The second thing is that users that have cognitive or learning disabilities might also have a harder time finding what they're looking for or understanding if they are able to find it. And then some people with limited short-term memory actually rely on descriptive headings to help them predict what's going to be in each section. So without proper content organization, you really are creating barriers for some of these users. So the second practice that could be problematic for your users is complex writing that has a really high readability level. And so this is a really simple tool here called Hemingway Editor, and it evaluates the readability level of your content. So just to show you what the tool looks like, this is basically, you put your content into this tool and it will give you a readability score. And so the readability score gauges the lowest education needed to understand your writing. So when you're writing for the web, you want to aim for about a grade 6 to 8 reading level. And so you would just put your content in and it's going to adjust all of these metrics as you write. So this evaluation here shows that the content that I was looking at is actually at a postgraduate level, and that's really too high for this content. So let's move on to some examples of complex and difficult writing. Here on the left is a page from the Rhodes Wellness College website, and it's targeted at potential students who might be considering one of their programs. So what you're looking at here is really just 2 sentences. They're 2 really long sentences. They're both rated by the Hemingway Editor as being very hard to read, and they have a postgraduate level readability score. And so that level of complexity is really just, it's not warranted for this particular content. It could easily be written at like a grade 8 reading level. So this is another example. This one is from the Department of Homeland Security in the US. So this is meant to explain the process of how to actually immigrate to the US. And so really it's targeting an international audience. And yet you can see that the Hemingway Editor tool has rated 50% of the sentences as being hard to read, and is also written at a grade 12 readability level. So again, this is just too high for this type of content. So I'm going to be working through an example in the next section, and I'll actually show you how to address these types of issues. So what are the impacts of really complex writing? Why is it problematic? So first, it's going to be harder to understand for everyone. And many people with cognitive or learning disabilities are going to have a really hard time understanding the content and also understanding the context. If you're using things like metaphors, slang, if you've got acronyms or difficult or unusual words or phrases, these can all create barriers for understanding, and it can be really frustrating for your users. And some of these users won't actually be able to overcome these barriers despite their efforts. And so in those cases, unfortunately, essentially those people are excluded. So the third aspect of your writing practices that could be problematic for your users is link text. So if you look at the first two, organization, writing, these are larger principles that should be applied throughout all of your web content. This last one, link text, is a little bit more specific, but it is worth calling out specifically because it's really important for users who are using assistive technologies that this one be done correctly. So let's take a look at some examples of poor link text. So the first two examples here at the top are from the Hydro One website. And this is basically BC Hydro, but it's the Ontario version. And then the two underneath are from the Uber website. So in all of these cases, you can see that these links, if you were to take them out of context and just read the links themselves, they wouldn't really make sense. And this is really important for assistive technology users. Also, the links are pretty generic, right? They don't actually give you any information on what you're going to find on the destination page. And then also at the bottom here, you've got a couple of links that have different text, but they really do serve the same purpose. So one of them says more information, and the other one says learn more. And they're basically saying the same thing, but they've used different phrases. And so that's an inconsistency that doesn't need to be there. So what happens when link text is not descriptive and doesn't actually make sense out of context? So first, people with limited dexterity who are using speech recognition software, they may want to activate a link using voice command. So for example, they'll say click, and then they'll say the link text. Now, if you have multiple links with the same name on the page, then these users are going to have to carry out a few extra steps to be able to activate specific links. Users who are using a screen reader are often going to be able to jump from one link to another, and they can also pull up a list of just the links that are on the page out of context. And so if the links don't actually make sense without the surrounding text, then these users are actually going to have to tab through the content just to get that extra context. So you're creating extra work. And this is also true for users who are only using a keyboard without a mouse. And it's also worth noting that screen readers will actually read an entire link. So if you have really long link text, that can be really frustrating because people can't just skip over the long link text. And so if we want to reduce barriers for people with disabilities when we're actually creating content and writing, we really do need to make sure that the content is organized, it's written in plain language, and we want to include link text that's descriptive and stands alone out of context. So how do you actually do all of this? How can you help people with disabilities access your content through the way that you write? So I'm going to walk you through two examples. The first one is I will show you how to create good on-page content organization by using headings, sections, and lists. And in the second, I'm going to show you how to write for user-focused plain language so that your content is easier to understand. And I'll also walk you through how to create good link text. So let's start with on-page structure. So I'm going to be using this page here. You've seen it a couple of times now. This is from the BC Assessment website, and I'm going to work through this and show you how we can create better organization on the page. So just so you have a little bit of background, this page is on the BC Assessment website. BC Assessment is a Crown corporation in BC, and every year they assess the values of all the properties in the province. So if you own a property in BC, you're going to get a notice from them every year, and it's going to say, here's how much your property is worth as of this year. And so for property owners, this can be a pretty big deal. So if you get an assessed value for your property that ends up being higher than you expected, then you might actually be worried because it might mean you have to pay more property taxes. And so that can be upsetting because the amount of property tax you pay is partially depends on how much your property is actually worth. And then on the other side, if your assessed value is lower than you expected, then you might actually be concerned. Maybe you were thinking of selling your property in the next year or two, and now you're wondering if you're going to get as much for it as you thought you would. And so this can be a really emotional situation. And the page that you're looking at is actually the page that you would come to if you disagreed with your assessed value, or you were concerned that it wasn't accurate. And so this page is supposed to tell you what to do. So let's take a closer look at what's actually happening on this page. On the left, what I've done is I read through the page and I pulled out and listed on the right side what they're actually asking us to do if we disagree with our assessed property value. So you can see that there's this sequence of steps from 1 to 6 that they're asking the user to go through. You're supposed to go through it in this order. But if you map that list to where they actually discuss each of those steps on the page itself, you can see that it's this huge, it's kind of a mess, right? So for example, if you look at step 3, I've indicated that with the number 3 and the pink highlight, you can see just how scattered it is all over the page. And the same thing is the case with step 2. You've got the orange text, and you can see that it's also kind of mixed in with step 4 and step 3, and it's all just kind of tangled together. And it makes it really hard for the user to try to figure out what they're being asked to do and what the order is that they should do it in. And just to make everything worse, if you look at the bottom here, they've got this section where they basically say, by the way, if you fall into this other category, then none of the above actually applies to you. And you need to go do this other thing over here. And so imagine you get through this whole page and you decipher all of this, and then you get to the bottom and you realize this doesn't even apply to you and you need to do something else entirely. So that would be really frustrating. So a big part of why this page is so confusing is because things are not organized on the page. They're not organized into sections. And so it ends up just being a scattered mess. So how do we fix this? So before we dig into that, I just want to quickly take a look at some existing guidelines just for an idea of what is required at a minimum. So the most widely accepted standards for accessibility are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. A lot of you may be familiar with those. They're developed by the W3C, and they are the most internationally recognized standards for accessibility. So we're going to go ahead and use these as a guide as I work through some of these examples. And so the 3 that are relevant in this case, in this particular example, are the ones that I've listed here, and that's for page titles and section headings. And so the criteria are that web pages have titles that describe the topic or purpose. And for section headings, they should be used to organize the content, and they should also describe the topic or purpose. And I just want to note here that I've simplified these guidelines for the purposes of working through these examples. For some of these guidelines that we'll be working with, they're a little bit more nuanced. There's a little bit more to them than what I've got here. So if you want to know more about them, definitely check them out on the W3 website. But for our purposes, we can use these simpler versions. So if we look at the page title, which is appeals, technically you could argue that it meets the standard, since appeals is one of the topics that's discussed on the page. But really, filing an appeal is just one of the steps that I had outlined. And so it's actually not the most descriptive title. So I think we can do better. So here are some tips for creating effective page titles. So first, your page title should accurately reflect the topic of your page. You want your most unique and relevant information first, and you want the title itself to be unique compared to all of the other pages on the website. And it should also be as short as possible. And specifically for task-based pages, which is what we're working with right now, it's good to start with an action verb ending in ing. For search engine optimization, you should incorporate SEO keywords where it makes sense, but you don't ever want to force them at the expense of the user's needs or the user's understanding of the content. And you want to aim for about 60 to 70 characters because typically search engines will likely cut off the rest in the search engine results. So I went ahead and I came up with a new title here. It's disagreeing with your assessed property value. So this one meets most of the criteria here, except for the SEO keywords criteria. And this is because you would rely on an SEO strategy and research to know what keywords you're actually targeting. We don't have access to that here, so I haven't included it. But normally I would take a look at the keywords I'm trying to rank for and see if there's an opportunity to work them into the title without, obscuring the needs of the user. So let's move on to section headings here. So for section headings, since they don't actually have any on this page to begin with, clearly they don't meet this standard. And so let's take a look at some tips on how to create effective section headings. So first, the content should be broken out with one topic per heading or subheading and one idea per paragraph. So that's usually a good rule of thumb. Section headings should be descriptive so that it's clear what the user is actually going to find in the content underneath it. And you want to place the most important words first in the heading. It's also good to avoid anything clever. You want to prioritize clarity over cleverness. And this one can sometimes be challenging, but you always want to be clear. And each heading on the page should be unique and not generic. So you never want to use multiples of the same heading more than once on the page. You want to tag headings H1 to H6. So don't skip levels, and also only use one H1 because that's going to be your page title and there should only be one. And headings on the page should also be consistent and parallel in structure. So I'll show you what that means in a second. And they should be concise and to the point. So I went ahead here and I created section headings for the page that I've been working through. So you can see that each of these H2s actually represents one of those sequenced steps that the page had recommended. And I've also included any deadlines in the heading itself so that users who are quickly scanning the page, either visually or using an assistive technology, don't miss anything important. And you can also see that, as I mentioned, these H2s have parallel structure. So they all start with the phrase step and then the number. And that just happens to be the case for these because it is a series of steps. But then that's followed by a verb. And you can see that they're all sort of similar in structure. It starts with the same verb tense, present tense. So you've got review, contact, file, prepare, file. And so that's parallel structure. So now I'll talk a little bit about one thing that actually isn't required by the guidelines, and that's bullet points. So bullet points are not explicitly required by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but they are recommended, and they do make content much easier to scan. They also improve the user experience because of this. So let's look at some tips for using bullet lists. So bullet lists are great replacements for inline lists of items, and that's because they're a lot easier to scan, as I mentioned. And so use them whenever you can. I use a bulleted list for related terms when the sequence of those terms is not important, and use a numbered or an ordered list to show steps in a process or the number of parts in a whole. Again, you want to use parallel structure for all list items. And so this means that you start each bullet with the same part of speech so that it doesn't sound awkward or disjointed. And if you have a list that has multiple levels in it, you want to use an ordered list with a different numbering system for the first level than for the second level. And this is going to be important for users who are using assistive technologies because it'll allow them to actually see the structure of the list rather than just seeing a flat list. And you also want to try to structure your longer lists into smaller lists that are separated with headings. So I've turned one of the paragraphs on the page that we've been working through into a list just to show you how visually different they can look. And so if you look at the original version on the top, you can see that you kind of have to skim the paragraph just to figure out what's going on and to see what's there. Whereas in the bottom, you can look at the bullet list and it's really easy to just quickly scan through the information and see, kind of at a glance if there's anything useful there for you. So after rewriting the whole page, you can see the difference between the right and the left side, the right side being the one that I rewrote. So even though this side looks longer, it is a lot easier for a user to just really quickly scan it and find what they need. And the steps are really clearly separated and they're also in sequence. So it's really easy to figure out what you actually need to do next. The rewritten version would also be a lot easier for people who are using just a keyboard or who are using a screen reader, but it's also going to be easier for people who have cognitive or learning disabilities, memory impairments. And this is because they have a lot more visual cues, and they also have descriptive headings that help them because it tells you what's coming. And so it lays out content a lot more clearly. So let's move on to the second example now. So this is where I'm going to show you how to improve the writing itself and how to make it easier to understand. So I'll use this page here as an example. This page is from the McGill University website, and I'm going to work through it to just show you how to improve the writing. So this is a page for graduate and postdoc students at McGill University. And as you can see, it provides career and professional development resources. And it's a really great example to use for this because the structure of it is actually already really well done. And so we can just forget about structure and focus on the writing. So if you look at the structure, you've got the title, you've already got section headings. And if you were to expand these elements here, you would see that they even have bullets. So that's really great. But how easy is it to actually understand? So let's take a look at just this first section that I've indicated here, and I'll work through that. So if we look at these headings and just kind of scan through the headings alone, we can see campus life and engagement, what they do, and contact them. So from looking at these headings, none of it really tells us what this section is actually about. So as a user, I don't know if I'm getting, or I don't know what I'm getting from campus life and engagement. And so what that means is now I have to read the text that's right underneath it. So let's read that. It says, campus life and engagement offer programs centered on the theme of leadership development. Okay, so now I know that the topic is leadership development, but I can see that I would never have been able to guess that from just the heading, campus life and engagement. And I also don't really have any information on what these programs are about that it references. So I might try to expand these elements here. And if I did that, I could read this and see that there's a little bit more information, but there's still a lot that's unclear. So for example, this first bullet says, offer workshops and a semi-annual conference as part of an emerging leaders program. So from reading this bullet, I don't have a sense of what the workshops or the conference are actually about. I'm kind of left wondering what I'm going to get out of them. And also, I don't know what's going to be required of me for these. And so that's one thing. And then I also don't know what the Emerging Leaders Program is, right? This is likely internal jargon that doesn't actually mean anything to most users. Also, the readability level is too high. It's at a grade 11 level. And you could say that this page is for graduate and postdoc students. So maybe you could argue that they can handle it. But what I would say is the content itself does not warrant for the level to be this high, right? This information could very clearly be communicated at a grade 6 to 8 reading level, and that would make it easier to read for everyone. And the other thing I wanted to say is I've underlined these phrases here. I consider these phrases to be really organization centric. So phrases like campus life and engagement offer and what they do. And these phrases put the university or the department at the center of the content. So they're saying like, here's what we do, here's what we offer, here's what we're all about. And framing things in this way makes it hard for users to figure out exactly what they're going to get out of the offering, right? It's hard for them to know what they're going to benefit, how they're going to benefit. And so if you think about how much work is actually required to frame things around your user and their needs, imagine all the things you have to do. You have to understand who they are. You have to know what they care about. You have to understand their pain points, their challenges. And then you need to take all of that and use it to frame your content so that it's really clear to your users how whatever you're offering is going to meet their needs and how you're going to benefit them. And so this is a lot of work. And what I really want to stress here is that at the end of the day, that work needs to get done, right? Someone is going to have to do that work. So if you don't do that work, if you don't take on that burden of creating user-focused content, then you're basically putting the onus on them to decipher and figure out from your content what it's actually going to do for them, what you're going to do for them. And so they have to connect all these dots, and that's really not a great user experience. So how do we fix this? So first, let's take a look again at our guidelines just to get a sense of where we need to be at a minimum. So we've already seen the first two on the page here, page titles and headings and labels. So we can skip over those and just look at this third one. So this third one is link purpose, and it requires that the purpose of the link be clear from the link text alone. And we also have these additional three. So these ones are a little bit more about using plain language. So unusual words and phrases, abbreviations, these should all be defined, and the text should be at about a grade 8 reading level. So let's look at our example again. We can look at the page title and the section headings. So the page title, Career and Professional Development, I would say this one's pretty good. The only change I might make is to add resources to the end. So it's Career and Professional Development Resources, but it gets a little bit long. So I'm not sure. I would need to look at the CMS requirements and constraints and just consider whether it fits with the rest of the site. But that is the only change I might make. But the section headings do need some work. So what I've done is I've revised them to be a little bit more descriptive. And so this is what we have. You can see that campus life and engagement becomes develop leadership and facilitation skills. What they do becomes what's available to you, and contact them becomes get in touch to learn more. So now let's take a look at the link text next. So the link text doesn't really make sense if you read it out of context. So you've got workshops, semi-annual conference, leading effective discussions, facilitation skills for graduate students. These aren't the best link text. So let's see how we can make them better. So we've got some tips here for creating descriptive link text. So first, you don't want to overuse links. Too many of them can be distracting. And you want to make sure that they're concise and descriptive, and it should be clear what the user is actually going to find on the destination page if they click that link. And the text should be short. If you remember, I said earlier that screen readers will actually read the entire link, and users who are using speech recognition might want to use a voice command. And so they would have to say the entire link text. And so you don't want it to be long. It should be short and unique. And you want to be consistent. Don't ever use URLs themselves as part of the link text. And you don't need to use things like link to or link in your text, because assistive technologies will already pick up on that and announce it. So I've rewritten the link text here for the section that we've been working through. So you can see that workshops becomes build leadership skills through a suite of 90-minute workshops. Semi-annual conference becomes free emerging leaders mini conference. Leading effective discussions, facilitation skills for graduate students becomes learn facilitation skills through a one-day workshop. And send an email becomes the written out version of the email address, because this is going to offer more flexibility and more predictability for your users. So now let's take a look at these last three standards here. We need to define any unusual words. There aren't really any unusual words in this section, so we're good with that. There is one abbreviation here, but you can see that they've actually handled it correctly. They've provided the whole longer version first, and then they've indicated the abbreviated version in brackets for their first use. So that's exactly what they should be doing. But we do need to work on the reading level here. So here are some tips for creating user-focused plain language content. So first, you should use shorter words and simpler sentences, and you want to aim for that grade 6 to 8 reading level. And you want to try and use active voice instead of passive voice. So for example, instead of saying something like the squirrel was chased by the dog, this is passive, you would say the dog chased the squirrel. You want to take a user-focused approach. So this means you want to speak directly to your audience with words like you and your. And you also want to frame it around their needs, like I had talked about earlier. So you want to make it really easy for them. And also researching your users will help with that, because you'll have a better sense of what it is that they need. And finally, you want to put the most important information first. So that would be at the top of the page, at the front of the sentence, at the beginning of your paragraph. So you never want to assume that your users are going to read every word, because research has shown that they really just don't do that. So I've gone ahead here and rewritten this first section just to show the difference so we can compare them. So the first sentence in this section originally read, "Campus life and engagement offer programs centered on the theme of leadership development." So now it reads, "You'll develop strong leadership skills and network with like-minded students." Now, if the campus life and engagement department felt very strongly that their name should stay somewhere on the page, then this is how I would include that here. So I would add it as a second sentence, just so that it minimally interferes with user needs. And this is something that actually does happen pretty often. So if you do have to use branding, there is a way to make it sort of a little bit less intrusive and stay out of the way of the user. But I honestly, I would recommend to leave it out. So we're going to move forward without it here. So next, if we look at this first bullet under what they do, it originally read, "Offer workshops and a semi-annual conference as part of an emerging leaders program." So now I've split this up into two different bullets in the newer version. So the first one is, "Build leadership skills through a suite of 90-minute workshops on a variety of topics like ethics, communication, and conflict resolution." And the second one is, "Explore leadership and meet other like-minded students by attending the free Emerging Leaders mini conference." So this is a far more descriptive way of presenting the information, and it even gives you a sense of the types of topics that the workshop is actually about and what you're actually going to get out of the conference. And so there's a much better chance that a user who's reading this will be able to make a decision about whether it's relevant for them and whether they want to learn more, or maybe it's not relevant to them and they want to move on. So they can make that decision more quickly. Okay, so now that you have an idea of how to improve content organization on the page and write in a way that's going to be easier to understand, especially for people who have disabilities, I just want to take a couple of minutes just to talk about the next steps, and then I'll wrap things up. So where can you go from here? So it really depends on where your organization is at with accessibility. So the W3C has some really great resources on how to actually move forward with web accessibility in your organization. So if you're just starting out, you can take a look at these resources, and they do a really good job of taking you through these different stages of initiating, planning, implementing, and sustaining accessibility practices in your organization. On the other hand, if you need to urgently address accessibility in an ongoing web project, then they've also developed this web accessibility first aid resource, and you can access that through the same link. And so that's really where I would recommend starting. So during this presentation, I've talked about how designing for web accessibility really at its core is about designing content that's flexible so that users can decide how they want to access it and be able to access it regardless of their preference, their ability, and their environment or situation. You've also seen that by designing for accessibility, you're actually making access possible for those 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 people who are living with disabilities. But in the process, you're also planning for these ability barriers that arise pretty much for everyone in certain situations and environments. And this really does improve the user experience for all of your users. I'm hoping that through the examples that I've worked through, you have an idea of just how transformative it can be for your content when you organize it well on the page, and when you write in a way that's easy for your users to understand and act on, and also when you use effective and descriptive link text. Unfortunately, for people with disabilities, this kind of a page that we worked through is actually something they encounter far too often. And when you add up all of the pages like this that are out there that they have to decipher, you start to understand just how frustrating of an experience it must be. And so in the best case, those that are able to go through a page like this and untangle it and understand what's going on, they're just going to have a terrible experience, right? And in the worst case scenario, there are going to be people who just can't make sense of this page. And in the end, they don't get to participate. They don't benefit from the content and they get left out. And really, that does not create, equal opportunities for everyone at all. So I really like this quote here by Steve Krug. He says, "The one argument for accessibility that doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our jobs a little bit better?" And I think he makes a really good point. It really doesn't take much more than that. So I just want to thank all of you for listening. And I hope that somewhere in this talk, you found some opportunity, even if it's tiny, to do your jobs just a little bit better. If you want more information about creating user-focused content, you can feel free to check out the articles on our website or sign up for our newsletter. Thank you.